Albert Breer, the Monday Morning Quarterback, senior NFL reporter, joining us on the program. All right, let me start with the Jaguars. What is Jacksonville doing?
Doesn't seem like they know themselves. You know, I think the fact that the owner isn't around a lot probably affected this process. And I think he wanted somebody to help him. Shad Khan did with the coaching search, which I think in the past has been why you've seen a bunch of half measures. In the decade and a half that he's owned the team, he's only done a clean sweep once, despite a lot of losing, and that was a long time ago. He didn't want to go it alone, so he holds on to Trent Baalke. And after 2 weeks, they realized what I think everyone had known all along, which was Trent Baalke was a serious impediment towards them getting the right head coach. And there were a lot of coaches who didn't want to work with Trent based on his past history, based on the clashes that he had with a bunch of different people over the years. You want to go back to San Francisco, Jim Harbaugh. More recently, obviously, Doug Peterson there over the last couple of years and some issues that he had with Peterson and his staff. And so, what is it, 16 days later, 17 days later, they're sort of hitting reset and starting over again. Now, they really like Robert Saleh, who will be in there tomorrow for a second interview. And I think there's a chance they open it back up and, maybe bring guys like Joe Brady back next week. But obviously now they've got to concurrently run a general manager search as well. And I think that sort of resets the whole process. And, I think then you see guys like Ian Cunningham coming in to interview for the job. The thing that sucks there is that you've taken some viable candidates off the table on that end too, whereas, on the head coach side now, Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn, Mike Vrabel, guys who might have had an interest in the job if Trent Baalke hadn't been there are off the table. Now you got qualified general manager candidates like Mike Borgonzi in Tennessee, John Spytek in Vegas, who are off the table as well.
What's this say about Trevor Lawrence? I think that's the bigger picture, that any coach who's coming in wants to know the quarterbacking situation. Mm-hmm. You would think that would have been a positive for Jacksonville to have Trevor Lawrence, that you would have the coaches would be running for that job, that you got your franchise quarterback. I think it says a lot about Trevor Lawrence in this situation.
I think it says more about Trent Baalke, don't you? I mean,
yes. I was shocked that they were going to keep him. I can replace a GM. I'm not going to be able to replace Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, and I think that's and that's part of it, of course. There are some differing opinions on Trevor Lawrence, but I think everybody agrees that he's talented, and you can win with him. Now, is he worth $55 million a year? You might get some divergent opinions on that. And I think as he came into the league, I would say as he came into the league, there was a feeling that this guy's more raw than anyone really thought. And it was a result of playing in a pretty simplistic offense at Clemson. He had played a lot of football there, but, he wasn't doing a lot of NFL things there, and obviously playing on a supremely talented team as well. So I think he's got ability, that's for sure. The physical traits are all there. The question is, can you get him to that next level? And I mean, look, in the AFC right now, I'd argue you've got maybe the four best players in the sport at that position in Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Joe Burrow. And so is Trevor Lawrence good enough to break through that glass ceiling? I think that's a fair question to ask.
All right. What are the Cowboys doing?
Another one where I'm not sure they are even quite sure, which is mind blowing to me because they had a year to prepare for this, Dan. It was no secret. They were the ones that created this situation for themselves where Mike McCarthy was in a contract year. I actually believe that if he had term left on his contract, they would have held on to him for another year. But because they created that situation for themselves, things got awkward after the year. There was no real negotiation and they cut it off, 8 days after other teams are already into their coaching searches. And so they went into this thing behind and they were playing catch up. It kind of cut them off from talking to the Lions assistants and the Chiefs assistants when, other teams were doing that. And now you see them leaning back on familiarity and, the names are different, of course. But
why aren't they interviewing Ben Johnson? Why didn't they Zoom Ben Johnson?
because it was too late. They didn't have a chance to because the rules say if you're like for the teams that had the buys, right? Lions and Chiefs, that window's only open through the wild card round.
But
So
they put
once
themselves in this position, though, Albert.
right, then that's what I'm saying. They created that situation for
Okay.
themselves. Like if they had said on Monday of whatever the date was, the Monday right after the season, if they had just said, all right, like that's it, we're walking away from Mike McCarthy, then they certainly could have gone and talked to Ben Johnson. I think Mike Vrabel would have been really interested in that job. And part of the reason why the Patriots moved as fast as they did was that they knew there was a relationship there between Vrabel and the Joneses, and the Joneses would have been really interested in Mike Vrabel.
You're making this even worse for Cowboys that they didn't get rid of Mike McCarthy, so they could have interviewed Ben Johnson, and Mike Vrabel probably would have been interested in taking that job.
Yeah.
Other than that, enjoy Brian Schottenheimer as your new head coach.
And I think like to me, isn't the tell though, Dan, like who they're looking at? Like, what do you do if you're really lost? You'll lean back on familiarity, right? Deion Sanders, Kellen Moore, Brian Schottenheimer, Jason Witten.
Yeah.
Like the names that you're hearing here are all names they're familiar with, which is exactly what you would do if you didn't have a plan, right? Like, so it's I don't know. I mean, like looking at where that team is, they're in a funky spot from a contract standpoint. Obviously, they just signed Dak and CeeDee Lamb. They're in for another big one this offseason with Micah Parsons, and that's going to be a big box decision. I think waiting on him, now he's going to ask for $40 million a year. And, I'd say as a player, he's certainly worth it. So they're in this weird spot from a team standpoint. And like now you look at where they're at. I mean, is the answer for them what they did in 2007 when they brought back Jason Garrett, and Jason Garrett was sort of the coach in waiting, and then they had Wade Phillips as the experienced hand there. Is that what they're going to wind up doing with Brian Schottenheimer and Jason Witten? Are they going to go back to the well with Kellen Moore, which would kind of be what the plan had been a few years ago, that Kellen Moore would be the future head coach of the Cowboys? Do they really take a swing and do Deion Sanders? I mean, all the names you're hearing now are names they're familiar with. And I just, you do have to question whether or not their thinking has gotten way too insular there.
Talking to Albert Breer, the Monday Morning Quarterback, the mmqb.com is where you can find his articles. The Raiders, Tom Brady doesn't lose very often, but feels like he lost out on Ben Johnson and what that now means. Another organization, hey, we fired the coach, ... and we fired the general manager. And it felt like they were paving the way for Ben Johnson to come in and say, hey, you're going to be able to run this team, and we're going to get a GM that you can work with. But
yep,
that
was
certainly
happen. Yep, that was certainly the case. And I heard that Brady was enamored with Ben Johnson and really liked the idea of Ben Johnson. And Ben was going to turn down that interview, and Brady making calls and presenting a compelling vision was the reason why he took the interview. My understanding was like Ben really loved the vision that Brady put in front of him when they did have a chance to talk. And Brady made a real run at it. And I think pieces of this are that the comfort for Ben Johnson being in the Midwest, and his family was very comfortable in Detroit. Chicago is not that much different of a place if you're raising a family, and then finding a comfort level with the front office and with ownership there, and then you wind up landing in a spot that does have a young quarterback in Caleb Williams. So I think Brady was kind of climbing uphill on that one and almost made it, but not landing the guy forces you to pivot, and now he goes back into his past and brings in a guy he's really familiar with in John Spytek to help him out. I think that like sort of creates a reset for them a little bit on the coaching search. Spytek's a guy who's, I think, along with Mike Borgonzi, like those two guys were very, very ready the last couple of years. There were a lot of people that were stunned that they hadn't gotten jobs yet. And Spytek's pretty close with Brady. They played together at Michigan, and that's been a little overblown. They didn't really know each other very well then. Brady was the starting quarterback. Spytek was on the scout team. But over the 3 years they were together in Tampa, Spytek actually ran the Tuesday meeting that Belichick used to run for Brady in New England, that Nick Caserio used to run for Brady in New England, where you're looking at the next week's opponent. So meeting every week, breaking down the opponent a week ahead, like all that stuff that those two were doing together, they were able to form a little bit of a bond. And so when the door closes on Ben Johnson. Brady, went and got a guy he really respects in Spytech, and now I think they reset the coaching search a little bit, and we'll see where they go with that.
Better hire what the Jets did or what the Bears did?
I really like what the Jets did. I like both guys. Both guys I think will be good head coaches. I just look at like where the Jets are at, and I think the Jets. I think this was. I've been very critical of the Jets over the last few months. I think the Jets got something right here in that. I think Mike Tannenbaum being a guy who'd been there before, some of the executives maybe looking a little bit in the mirror, they realize like we need somebody who's going to embrace being here, and we need somebody who's going to embrace the spotlight of New York, and we need somebody who understands the dynamics of working in this franchise and the narratives that get spun out there and the fact that everybody thinks we're a circus. We need somebody who's going to embrace the challenge of that. And they've had a lot of guys over the last, couple decades that have come in there and said they were going to do that, but then in the end have sort of chafed against it. You know what I mean? Like, and have really chafed against the dynamics that exist in that franchise. And so I think going and finding somebody who's going to embrace the challenge of that, who understands the challenge of that, and a guy who's a first round pick there and played a bunch of years there, I think they got this one right. And I think if you spend 5 minutes around Aaron Glenn, he screams head coach. So I really like what the Jets did there. And I look, like I think the Bears got it right too. Like I think Ben Johnson's got a great future as a head coach. But I think just as far as like if you're talking about what a franchise needs, I think the Jets got exactly what they needed in hiring Aaron Glenn.
What about the Saints?
Yeah, that's another one. Like they've sort of leaned on familiarity a little bit there. Like the snowstorm has affected some things. They're gonna have Anthony Weaver back in there. They're trying to get Mike McCarthy in over the weekend. This one sort of seems like it might be McCarthy to me. McCarthy didn't initially McCarthy just took the trip to Chicago. I think McCarthy was a little bit more focused on the Chicago job. But just, with Mickey Loomis there and the roster being what it is and where it is right now, I think after you strike out on Aaron Glenn, who I would say was probably their first choice, you look at it and you say, okay, like what can we do to sort of stabilize the franchise and get ourselves in a position where maybe we can win a little bit with the current core, but then we're going to be set up to move on from that core and rebuild. And Mike McCarthy's volume of experience, I think, really helps him there. He, of course, was there in Green Bay when they went from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers. He really had a huge hand in developing Aaron Rodgers. And so, if you're looking at a situation where you've got an older quarterback and, you're looking to turn the page in a lot of spots in your roster, I think you do a lot worse than Mike McCarthy. So McCarthy makes a lot of sense to me. Here's the other thing. I just think perception of McCarthy is kind of screwed up. Put his resume next to Mike Tomlin's. What's the difference?
Oh, I've said it before. I think we just have this. When we see Mike McCarthy, it doesn't scream head coach. You look at Mike Tomlin. I think it's
optics. I agree with you. Yes. Like physical appearance, right?
Yes, absolutely. Sean Payton. Oh, he looks like a head coach. Mike Tomlin looks like a head coach. John Harbaugh, head coach. Wait, who's that guy? I mean, Andy Reid fought through this.
Yeah.
Where we looked at Andy Reid and you're like, that looks like the Kool-Aid guy. Like,
yeah.
He doesn't look like a coach. And I think McCarthy as well, the optics. But, I thought he was going to get a job, but I didn't know if it was going to be New Orleans. So that it feels like the game of musical
he was
chairs.
there. Here's the other thing is like he worked with Mickey Loomis for 5 years. And I do think like they wanted to be open-minded there. And look, I think Joe Brady is a good candidate there too. He's another one like where you look at him, he's got experience with the franchise and everything else. But, I think our own personal experiences are always a factor. And I think Mickey wants to get this one right. He understands he's at the end of his career. And, he's got a group of players that like he'd like to try to make at least maybe one more run with them before completely resetting. And I think McCarthy gives him the opportunity to do that as a guy that he worked with, again, for 5 years at the start of his time in New Orleans.
Always great to talk to you. Know you're busy. We'll see you at the Super Bowl. Thank you, Albert.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan.
Albert Breer, the MMQB. You can go to mmqb.com, senior NFL reporter. We'll take a break. Play of the day up next.